This is update for October 22, 2024, day 972 of the war and of the date update. Catch up for October 21, 20th, and 19th. I'm going to start with, say, macroeconomic general update, and then we're going to switch to the situation on the battlefield in Ukraine, which is becoming uglier by day for Ukraine, and I think regular viewers will not be surprised by that. It's unfortunately expected result of horrific policies inside of Ukraine. It's really driven by internal problems in Ukraine, not by let's say strengths of Russian army. But before we go there, let's actually go back a little bit to what I discussed on Friday, which was the sort of final report for the fiscal year in the U.S. that was prepared by U.S. Treasury, and I discussed about the deficits and obviously that's going up, and I would say it's out of control. So I just want to highlight that this is not in some ways just my sort of concerns and so on, but it's actually how market also perceives the situation. And I want to show you a very graphic that speaks for itself. So this was the rate for U.S. 10-year Treasury. So basically, it's a U.S. government borrowing from investors, from lenders, money for 10 years. And it's called Treasury because it really means just that it's a U.S. government. Similar situation, like I think in Germany, it's called bonds. In the UK, it's called gilts. Don't recall what it's called in France. I'm sure there is some, specific names, but really what that really means is those are governmental borrowings in each country, and they have just specific names. In the US, they happen to be called treasuries. So this is Friday. This is a 10-year interest rate at which US government is borrowing. As you can see, it was sort of settling closer to 4.05%. And market was closed, obviously, for weekend. In the morning, after market digested all of this information, and by market, I mean investors, right? So people, because market is really voting mechanism for investors. They vote with their money, basically, right? So, and what they saw did not, I guess, impress them in a negative way. So as you can see, the interest rate jumped close to 4.2% from, let's say, 4.06 or 7. For a 10-year Treasury, it's a very, very big move. This is very unusual. I'd say, I wouldn't say extraordinary, but it's clearly a sign that the investors are concerned with what's going on with the U.S. debt situation. And that's explanation for this huge jump. At the same time, there was no any macroeconomic news or macroeconomic reports that came out on Monday that could make this sort of move. So it was all digestion of those news that came on Friday night after market was closed, and then when market could react, it reacted on Monday morning in pretty negative way. The other part that shows that things are getting closer to the end in terms of growing debt is also gold, right? That's another important metric, and as you can see, gold was going up pretty much non-stop since sometime, say, mid-August, from like 2,400, roughly $50 per ounce, to 2,400 also, you could say 50. And also there was bump also related to this release of this Treasury report. So what I'm trying to explain why these two metrics are very important is first, because investors have two options. Because these two metrics are basically corroborating each other. So when investors, they're not comfortable with what's going on with increase in debt, because that really means that they lose their money, and so they buy less of the US debt, so therefore interest rate goes up. And what they do, they move into gold, because gold is true money, and so you cannot lose in gold. And so that's what's really happening, and that's why when I was discussing it in prior videos, I stated that whoever's going to be U.S. president, whatever they promise, it's not going to happen. What's going to happen is that person will have to deal with the fiscal problems in the U.S., and they are huge. And the only solution to those fiscal problems are really cutting expenses. You cannot tax, because the gap is so big. You cannot tax it. If you try to tax it, you're simply your taxes will simply go down. You will just simply destroy tax base, and you will actually collect less. So the only way to deal with this problem is cutting expenses, and that's why I mentioned in the past, the only way actually to deal where there is the solution is the following: is to pay less either retirees or reduce medical expenses, or I would say reduce military expenses. But reducing military expenses is not going to solve the problem. Not paying retirees, I guess, I don't know, probably not going to solve the problem. Not going to solve the problem either. And the only really big sort of fat cow is medical expenses, and they were going to get cut significantly. And that's why I mentioned in the past there will be problems with access to medical care unless you have money. So basically, more likely than not, that the medical care will switch to cash payments eventually, or at least there will be majority of it will be cash, and it will be much cheaper and will be more affordable to average person. However, that will create significant dislocations in the economy, because healthcare is about 20% of the US GDP, which is insanely big number. It's much higher than any developed Western country. Actually, used to be in the US roughly 5%. So as you can imagine, it needs to be reduced by 4 times. And that will create probably short-term economic depressive situation in the US. And obviously that will affect the rest of the world. And so what I'm trying to say, that moment is coming closer, because interest rates are going up, and the gold is telling the same story. So essentially, no matter what central bank will try to do, the president and so on, they simply cannot overpower market forces, and they will have to follow market forces, and they basically telling that opportunity to increase that out of control is coming to its end. And in this sort of related to this topic is BRICS meeting that's going on in Russia, in Kazan, in Russia, which is actually a Muslim part of Russia. I don't know if most people are aware of that. There is about like third of Russian population is Muslim, so it's not actually. It's somehow presented as some kind of Christian country. It's actually not. It's I would say the best way to say is conglomerate. of various sort of things, including Christianity and including um, Islam. So the main point that what I was trying to say is that Russia wants to build alternative to US dollar, and then they also want to build alternative payment system that would replace SWIFT, which SWIFT is controlled by West, or the dollar is controlled by West. And so because it creates significant problems for Russia right now with payments, there is a growing issues even with payments with China, where even regular consumer goods are sometimes the payments don't go through. And the problem is that this whole push is basically flop and it's destined to fail. It's not going to work. Russia is not going to create replacement for the dollar, or BRICS are not going to create replacement for dollar. They're not going to create any single currency, and their only chance is maybe they will create alternative payment system. That's a possibility, but it's still not going to work because there is no common currency, and that's a whole problem. There is that currency base is the sort of debt-based currency is relying on trust and relying on the morality of the society, because trust and morality in society are absolutely linked things, and the less moral society, the less trust it has, not only inside of the society, but from others, from outsiders. And I would go and say that Russia and most of the BRICS are low trust, low morality societies. So therefore, they, by definition, cannot create any credible currency, and it's not going to be a threat to US dollar by any means. The only way US dollar can be destroyed by actually self-destruction within the US. That's really the real threat, which is exactly what I'm pointing to, is that this interest rates and gold are pointing in that direction, and that's actually a real threat, not from Russia, not from China. They will never be able to really challenge, in this case, US dollar. Even to the point that, for example, all of these countries, BRIC countries, they can switch to using gold, basically gold standard, to trade, and that would actually work, and that would actually can really destroy US dollar or euro. It doesn't matter, any Western country. Western currency. But gold is essentially equal to morality, equal to high trust. So the country that does not have that will never use gold, because it essentially will destroy it from within, because it's built on immoral things, and it's essentially, you bring morality into the immoral society, it will crash simply. And so that's why they will also never use gold as a currency, which, as I stated, it could have been done easily long time ago, but yet they not doing it, and they will not resort to that. So now let's actually move to the next topic, and this was actually driven by one of the viewers who wrote email to me and asked to just talk a little bit about the whole situation in the Near and Middle East and what's going on, including discuss Georgia, Azerbaijan, Armenia, which is former Soviet parts of the Soviet Union. So the situation in this whole region is as difficult as it gets, where pretty much everybody is against everybody else. So I'll start actually with sort of easier part, which is Turkey and Azerbaijan. So Turkey and Azerbaijan are essentially the same ethnic group, which means the same DNA, which means really the strong connection, a strong connection as you can imagine. And so they are separated by Armenia from each other, and obviously they want to call it reunite at the expense of Armenia, and so they, Azerbaijan in this case, slowly but surely attempting to basically, I wouldn't say conquer entire Armenia, but create a corridor that can basically unite it with Turkey. The other problem here is southern Azerbaijan is actually now part of Iran, and Iran is extremely, obviously negative towards all of this so-called reunification and destruction of Armenia. So they are sort of naturally supporting Armenia because they are separating Azerbaijan and Turkey from each other. So this is sort of one situation that's going on. Then there is other situation related to Russia. Georgia essentially flipped from being pro-Western country to being, say, pro-Russian and mostly actually self-interested. And I think the goal is they want to get back areas that were captured by Russia. And so they hope that by, distancing themselves from the West and having sort of anti-West rhetoric, that Russia will give them those territories in return, which is a gamble. Don't know. I would say I would be surprised that that's going to happen, but that's that. I'd say I understand why Georgian leadership is doing what they're doing. I'm not saying I agree, but that's at least understandable. And Azerbaijan was always sort of was kind of distanced itself from the West. They have they obviously act in their own self-interest. They have crude oil, and so they basically have let's say enough financial resources to sustain themselves. So this is situation in this sort of Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan, and Turkey. And then actually in terms of Russian invasion in Ukraine, at first actually Azerbaijan was aligned with Ukraine. Georgia was at least neutral, somewhat supportive, and Armenia actually was aligned with Russia. And by now, it actually flipped. Right, largely, obviously, Georgia is more aligned with Russia. Azerbaijan at best neutral, and Armenia actually sort of more pro-Ukraine right now, and sort of distancing itself from Russia. The problem with Armenia is it has internal societal problems, and the symptom is corruption. But the problems are more deeper, and I'm not the expert in Armenia to sort of discuss what's going on there. Then the next is more related to Israel, and it's more Iran. Israel situation where Iran is essentially controlling or has significant influence over Iraq government, and that's, I would say, one of the sort of big problems. Is in some ways it's like I wouldn't say puppet government, but not far from there. And the north of Iraq is controlled by Kurds. So it's also, the country is essentially split into pieces. Similar situation with Syria, and obviously Kurds is another important part in this all of the equation, because they're essentially split between three countries, if not even four. But the biggest sort of issue there is that Iraq has under strong influence of Iran. Similar situation in Syria, so this opens sort of passage for Iran towards Israel, even directly attacking Israel, versus Israel does not have the same situation. They cannot simply, there is no sort of land connection, or they really need to, as you can see, go through two countries where there could be huge resistance. Even air attacks, I don't know, they're going to be questionable. So it's it's very asymmetric situation, and strategically, Israel is very disadvantaged in this situation. Even though right now everything is looking very positive on the surface for Israel, with all of the attacks that it's doing in Gaza and in Lebanon, and it seems like it's winning. It's really being aggressive, I would say, and at the same time, it's more driven by the situation where I think there's probably realization that Israel is in very difficult strategic long-term situation due to what I just discussed here. The only sort of positive part for Israel is that Jordan is completely neutral. It's not controlled by Iran. It's quite independent, I would say, neutral, that it's somewhat pro-Western aligned. So it at least that part of the Israel border is not sort of threatened. The really threat is this area, Lebanon, Syria, and so on. So hopefully that addresses this whole situation at, I would say, high level. Now let's switch a little bit closer you actually switch to the situation in Ukraine and battlefield in Ukraine. And there was, from the same viewer, was another sort of question, the logic, and he was thinking that logic for North Korean troops coming to Ukraine is to get experience, and which I think they're not gonna get any positive experience, because first of all, whatever is claimed, I don't know, there's numbers circulating 12,000. It's not that you cannot expand that experience from 12,000 to the army that's, I think, is 1.2, 1.3 or something like that million people. Simply doesn't work that way. The only way to get experience is actually commit the entire army. There is no other way to get that experience. So that's the first thing. And then actually related thought is that experience or what is sort of positive and useful experience there is from the war in Ukraine that can be gained from both Russian army and Ukrainian army. It's not codifiable. It's not. It's coming from the basically bottom, from actual soldiers on the ground who are, doing things that are sort of not envisioned by the rules and regulations in the army, and doing things that, like, for example, this drones, this FPV drones, kamikaze drones, all of that's not envisioned in the rules of both Russian and Ukrainian army. This is total initiative from the very bottom, and it's supported by actually population who basically they're making these drones in garages, and it's like huge decentralized mesh or network, and it's much more developed on the Ukrainian side, less developed on the Russian side. And so you cannot replicate it in the regular army. Regular army in some ways is antithesis to this whole idea of decentralized system. And so far, this is where the strength of Ukraine is. In my view, this is not replicable to any regular Western army, because there is a lot of observers from the West who try to learn from this, or at least learn from this experience and so on, and gain something. And I think in the end, there won't be any result from that. There will be, or at least the results will be minimal to close to nothing, is because it's just structurally absolutely different from let's say regular Western armies. The same, very different from North Korea army or Chinese army or whatever. It's in some ways it's absolutely different, and so regular army cannot absorb that experience and replicate that experience simply. Even from the costs, I'll just give you simple, more sort of probably easier to understand, less sort of abstract saying, is the cost for all of this UAV drones is between $200 to $500. Western armies cannot procure those drones at those prices, because all of these drones are made in garages with low-cost labor, and that's not happening in the West. I mentioned this in the past. The weapon manufacturing industry is extremely centralized and I would say monopolized in the West, to the point that actually the monopolization of these industries is actually a threat to national securities, which probably not realized yet fully. But I think if things going to go in a negative direction in the world, I think the realization of that will come. Hopefully not too late. So this is the answer for all of this, replicating things, not the learning from Ukraine, and in my view, there is no other army that is in a way similar to Ukrainian army, and so culturally they simply cannot absorb this experience, because it's really about culture, which is in Ukraine it's extremely decentralized, and that's actually really I would say strength of Ukraine. And unfortunately, and I will even continue discussion of this topic, is that Ukrainian political and military leadership is absolutely foreign to Ukrainian culture from this perspective, because they don't understand decentralization. They actually attempt to centralize everything, and it turns into corruption, disempower everyone, and bring power to the very top, which destroys Ukraine from within. And that's what we're seeing on the battlefield in Ukraine. The fact that Ukraine went from the situation where there were people lining up to go and fight on the front line and being volunteer there in 2022, to the point that the government has to catch people and force them into the frontline units, and that doesn't work, because then those people simply desert, run away, and then you have holes, gaps in the front line, and Russian troops infiltrate, use those holes, and they advance, and Ukrainian front line the defensive line is essentially collapsing, and it's on the verge of pretty large scale collapse, where things really will cause political changes in Ukraine. That's where at this point it's heading, unless Ukraine capitulates, because Russia is very clear. They see this weakness. They understand they also analyze situation. They understand what's going on, and they understand that there is no need to offer anything sort of compromising. Russia is offering just capitulation essentially to Ukraine, and wants to control all of Ukraine. The same as actually goes for Moldova. I think that this recent elections that happened this weekend is a sign of that. So it's very clear that Russia wants to rebuild Russian empire. Let's say the Russian president wants to rebuild the Russian empire. You can look at the maps of Russian empire from the 19th century, and that's the vision for Russia. Because I mentioned before, there are two sort of main groups in Russia. One is imperial, it's like more capitalistic, using capitalism to extend its works to improve Russia, create economic base for conquest, and the other one, and that's represented by Russian president, and that's the reason why Russia was able to survive sanctions and actually still being able to continue to wage the war, because this group is much more aligned with the nature, with capitalism, which what it is. And then there's another group that's more represented by communists, really hardcore, rigid approach, and that approach for now is sort of has lost and dormant. But if there is a problem on the front line, then there will be attempt by that group to essentially take over. But at this point, things are really going very well for Russia. There is no question about it. And so political support for Russian president is pretty high. There is, I would say, there is no 1917 moment on the horizon for Russia at this moment. I think there is 1917 moment approaching Ukrainian leadership at some point. So hopefully that really provides a little bit more color in general what's going on, and hopefully answer the question from the viewer. Sorry. Now let's do walkthrough in a clockwise fashion, the way I always do. First start with Kursk region of Russia, where Ukrainian forces continuing to lose the control, or continuing to lose the territory that they control. So basically, Russian troops did not manage to encircle Ukrainian forces. They withdrew basically south, and they're still trying to essentially cut off, create connection between Mala-Laknya and Novoivanovka. So there is basically ongoing fighting here. This is the sort of the area of the most fierce fighting in this whole area. So far, I would say there is some kind of balance, and that balance was achieved by Ukrainian forces sort of withdrawing from this area north of it and essentially creating more higher density of troops, which essentially slow down Russian advance or let's say nearly stopped Russian advance at this point. So, which means also that for Russia to continue gaining territory, they need to bring more resources to this area, essentially. So there is sort of kind of like a temporary balance. Most likely Russia will bring more resources at some point, and we'll see when that happens. But in the long run, Ukraine is losing control of this region. Now let's look at the situation north of Kharkiv. And things here are quiet. Both sides are not seeking any sort of decisive results in this area. Now let's look at the situation on the North Lugansk section of the front line. Here, the most dangerous situation in this area, south and north of Kupiansk. Ukrainian forces attempting to sort of not allow Russian troops to fully control the eastern bank of Oskil River in this area, where I'm showing, starting from Kivsharivka all the way to the south to this where I'm showing. And that's, I would say, probably losing battle. It's in some ways I would call agony, and eventually Russian troops will fully control the eastern side of Oskil River, which then they will try to establish bridgeheads on the western side, and that's going to be extremely negative development for this section of the front line for Ukraine, because that really implies this whole area south of it is going to be eventually lost for Ukraine. And there is also pressure in the southern sector, but without sort of major territorial losses this time for Ukrainian forces. Now let's move to North Donbass section of the front line. And things here in the northern sector more or less stable, no major losses here. Where things sort of a little bit more difficult for Ukraine is around Chasiv. I mentioned in the past, Russian troops managed to gain significant advances south of Chasiv. There's no new updates in terms of sort of new advances by Russian troops. There's sort of temporary stability. It doesn't mean that things are truly stabilized. It's just the best way to describe it is Russian troops are regrouping and preparing for the next push. The sort of problem for Russian side is that they don't have enough resources to really push in full force here. And the reason they're able to even gain what they gain is truly because there is very little Ukrainian troops actually on the front line because of the desertions, as I mentioned, and that's really the sort of very simple but very logical explanation why Russian troops are advancing. It's not because they're sort of much better or there is some Russian military genius here, that how it's being presented by Russian propaganda. It's the root cause of Russian advance is actually in the problems on the Ukrainian side. And those problems, as I mentioned before, rooted in the problems in the political system and just generally a lack of fairness in society, and typical symptom and immorality in society, which typical symptom is corruption. And I don't even bring up all of this corruption scandal. That's pretty much every month there is some kind of large corruption scandal going on in Ukraine. It's just it's a sort of waste of time, let's put it this way. Now let's move south to central Donbass front line, where things are really, really bad going on for Ukrainian forces. And the biggest sort of problem is potential really large-scale collapse starting from Selidove all the way south to Bogoyavlenka. So this whole section is the most threatened, where things are, I would say, about to start collapsing in a really major way. And the problem with all of this is that this line of Selidove, Girnyk, Kurahove is essentially last major defensive obstacles on the path of Russian troops. After that, it's fairly straightforward way to the west, where there's basically small villages and just fields, and it's pretty unsupporting situation for Ukrainian army, giving especially desertions, very lack of troops to man the front line. So there is no contiguous front line. There are holes everywhere, and so that really means that may really open up for opportunity for Russian command to do really truly large-scale offensives with deep penetration, sort of what we've seen during World War II, with really huge collapses and potential encirclements. That's a real threat and real problem that Ukrainian forces, Ukraine is going to be facing with once this whole sort of last defensive line is lost. And let's actually look a little bit closer. I did not update the map, but it's still going to be sufficient. So Russian troops moved and they initiated fight for this village Vishneva, as you can see, near basically west of Selidove at this point. They also advanced here a little bit north of Selidove. So essentially Selidove is close to being circled and essentially lost. So we're witnessing probably last days of Ukrainian control of Selidove. Ukrainian troops probably might be even pulling out already out of it because there's no ability to hold it long for any longer, just because your supply line is literally under direct fire control. So it's very similar situation that happened in Vuhledar. Essentially, it's the same thing. So Russian command is using this simple textbook strategy. It's not rocket science. It's very straightforward. Have two pincers, usually north and south, and create threat of encirclement and force withdrawal. And so far, there were no ability to truly encircle any Ukrainian troops because they retreat in the last second. But that's how Russian troops, gaining this. What I'm trying to say is that Russian command kind of like wisened up, so they're not trying anymore to assault and storm sort of relatively large towns. They're realizing that it's less costly in terms of human lives and for the most part human lives, simply to kind of encircle them and force withdrawal of Ukrainian troops. And this strategy works very well. As I stated, we're probably witnessing last days of Selidove, if not already last days. Similar situation in Girnyk, where Russian troops actually managed to cross this stream, which not that hard. They approaching, essentially they controlling this whole sort of eastern side of the stream, and then they advance from the north, and there's also some advances from sort of from the west, because they essentially broke through near Izmailivka. So really Ukrainian forces are controlling sort of southern and southwestern part of Girnyk, and essentially at this point it's lost. And at the same time, this also means that Kurahove will need to be abandoned or evacuated, because then Russian troops will continue moving sort of a little bit in southwestern direction, which essentially creates threat of encirclement. And so this whole area is also we are probably witnessing sort of last days of Ukrainian control, and this is, as I mentioned before, essentially last large towns that create good opportunities for sort of defensive positions. And then it shows all villages and fields, which is going to be hard to hold on, given in which situation Ukrainian army is, where, as I say, there is a huge number of desertions from the army. And then similar situation is happening near Kurahove, where Ukrainian front line collapsed here, where I'm showing west of Maksymilyanivka, and essentially Russian troops at this point close to this blown up bridge, so they effectively control this whole area where I'm showing. So they're preparing to also probably not attack Kurahove. They're probably going to do the same thing. They're going to approach from the south and force withdrawal from that as well. So that's probably going to happen a little bit later after Selidove and Girnyk in this whole Kurahivka area, but that's next sort of shoe to drop, and that's really going to clear out, as I stated, the last strong defensive positions, and it's just going to be really difficult for Ukrainian army to hold on to the territory going forward there. Now let's move to situation on the Zaporizhya front line, and things here are more or less stable to the extent that this is also discussion of this area north of Vuhledar. Russian troops pressuring towards Bohayavlenka, which is very logical, because that's how they probably gonna cut off Kurahove and force withdrawal, because then they can just go sort of northwest, and that's gonna force withdrawal from Kurahove. So and then the next sort of stronghold on Ukrainian side is going to be this Velika Novosilka, and then pretty much then it's essentially open fields all the way to Zaporizhya, to Dnipro River. Now let's finish with the last section of the front line, which is along the Dnipro River, and things here are quiet, and as you can understand now, because there is huge opportunities opening up for Russian army up north, and I would say up east. That's all for today. Thanks for watching. Until next time. Bye bye.